Hello, everyone. This is Tony, co-founder and CEO of Shop Black, and today I'm joined by Mehrsa Baradaran. Mrsa is a best-selling author and law professor specializing in banking law at the University of California, Irvine. Congrats on your, I guess, one-year anniversary.
Thank you.
So your books have received significant national and international media coverage and have been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and now Shop Black. Congratulations.
The greatest honor.
Yes, you're welcome. The book that you wrote that I'd like to focus on today is this one, The Color of Money. So this book has basically become required reading for those who want to get a better understanding of how Black communities have been shut out of the financial system and how wealth creation in the Black community has been stagnated. So just want to, I guess, start off by asking what inspired you to write the book?
So I actually, I didn't intend to write the book that I ended up writing. I let the research sort of guide me. I had these sort of annoying tics that were bothering me in that, you know, a lot of times in banking, you see the big banks get all this like Federal Reserve money and bailouts and all this stuff. And then when it comes to alleviating poverty or inequality, the policymakers are always like, oh, well, you know, do microcredit or small dollar lending or, you know, just tiny little things like completely outside of that Federal Reserve or FDIC subsidized banking structure. And it just seemed really unfair to me. And so I was going to show basically what it is, the myth of being able to create wealth outside this system. And as I started digging into this research, I kind of hadn't realized that the Black banking sector is actually was this very a good way of showing how if you're segregated out of the banking sector in general, it's really impossible to accumulate wealth and even to participate in that sort of magic of banking. And then as the research kind of went on, I realized how a lot of white policymakers had used segregated banking as a way to reinforce inequality. And so that's something that I didn't anticipate seeing going into it. I thought I would just say like, hey, you know, we need, you know, we as, you know, those who want justice and equity to create public policies that create wealth in these communities in the same way that we did white communities. And then I realized, oh, actually the policymakers were using segregated banking as a way of reinforcing that white sort of systemic power.
So do you see that as something that happened then, or do you still see that happening now?
Yeah, I think, good question. I think it happens over and over again in different forms. So just as sort of progress evolves as we evolve, racism also evolves, or I should say in a way that is not a cabal or conspiracy, but a way that how do you reify power when you can't have slavery, right? You can't have convict leasing anymore, right? So these ways that as I follow through history, so you have slavery, which is this, you know, extractive economy. You're using slave bodies to create wealth, not just the labor side, but the capital side, right? You're borrowing money off of your holdings in slaves. And then as that, you know, as a war fought, then it evolves into sharecropping. And so you're using these different mechanisms of enforcement in sharecropping. You're like, well, you're free, but you can't have land. You can't work in these jobs. You have to buy this debt crop. And what you essentially have is a recreation of that plantation system, but now it's freedom, you know? And then, you know, you sort of, then you go, you know, through the New Deal, and it's like, well, you know, there are these racially explicit segregation zones in the North that don't look like, you know, Bull Connor and Jim Crow in the South, but are very much a segregation and Jim Crow, I call it Jim Crow credit, right? It's very nuanced. And then post-civil rights movement, I think you can no longer say this is a white man's government like they did previously, or you can't reimpose Jim Crow, but you can say, oh, well, we're not going to give reparations and we're not going to do integration, but how about, this black capitalism, which becomes Nixon's way of short-circuiting the momentum of the civil rights movement. So that's kind of what I did not anticipate finding in the research, which was really, eye-opening for me, actually. And I'm a cynical person. I had not anticipated that it was so just out there.
So the chapter regarding Nixon, that's the Capital Without Capitalism, right?
Yes, yeah, chapter 6. Yeah. And that was the hardest chapter to write. It took me basically half the time. It took me years to write that chapter because I wanted to get it right, and it hadn't been written elsewhere, and I wanted to make sure I had the facts right. And again, like, I couldn't believe that it was so explicit and so racist. And I think since I've written the book, that more has surfaced. But I was in the Nixon archives looking at memos between Alan Greenspan and Richard Nixon, saying this really racist, ways of kind of using capitalism and using really racially neutral language to cut these coalitions. So as to your point, sorry, this is a real tangential way of getting to your point, is it happening now? I think it will happen as this, because I think we're at another moment of demands for racial justice. And I can imagine that all of those corporations, like when JP Morgan is saying Black Lives Matter, and when the NFL is saying Black Lives Matter, Nike, you have to keep your eyes open for how that co-option of that language, morphs into a way of reifying the white power structure. And so I would just be very wary of corporate power adopting, co-opting the language of justice demands.
Right. I definitely believe it has been co-opted. I think it's been watered down, and it's overused at this point by many corporations who really don't give a crap.
Yeah.
The PR thing to say and put on your social media. Black Lives Matter and we support blah, blah, blah. But how are you really supporting?
How are you really supporting it? Yeah.
So,
and do you put your money where your mouth is, or are you just? I mean, it's easy to put social media sites like Black Lives Matter, but like where are you purchasing your goods from? What neighborhoods are you polluting? Where are you exploiting? What groups of people are you exploiting? Look at your hiring, right? Who are you hiring? Who are you promoting? All of that stuff is embedded in that.
Right. Robert Smith, I believe, the billionaire Robert Smith, he started an initiative where he is requesting or proposing that corporations, and I think the larger banks, take like 2% of their earnings or their revenue and deposit them into Black banks or funnel them into institutions that support Black-owned businesses. What are your thoughts on how and if that could work effectively, and the corporate response to that?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, I think 2% seems to me like a minimum, but it would also be significant. I mean, we're talking about 2% of JP Morgan. I mean, I talk about like the combined total of Black banks' capital is like a bad weekend for JP Morgan, right? JP Morgan's, it's $4 or $5 trillion company, and total the Black banks are maybe 10, 15 billion. And there's just vastly different scales, and that's just one bank. And so I think, yes, to get 2% of some of these big firms invested in, and we're not talking donations, like investments, right? Venture capital, capital investments, which have never been directly invested in the Black community. And I think that's, again, Black capitalism without capital. That's what I keep going back to, is like all of these Nixonian programs, which include, by the way, opportunity zones, and every program until now that has been directed at racial justice has been without capital. Now, there is capital involved, but it's the capitalists. It's tax cuts to private equity. But when we're talking about capital, because you're in business, you're actually talking about investments that are wealth creating, and that has not been available.
Yep. So speaking about wealth creating investments, let's back up slightly and talk about wealth. how is wealth created? Because there are misconceptions.
Yeah.
So what are your favorite misconceptions, and what's the right way to do it?
Yeah. So wealth, when we talk about wealth, sometimes we want to look up and like, well, how is Oprah's wealth and LeBron James' wealth and, Bill Gates or whatever? That's the top 1%. That wealth is both born, with in the right place. Like if we're talking about the Fortune 500, these are people born into wealth who didn't blow it, or who were just like the Steve Jobs, the Bill Gates, the Oprahs, like just incredibly talented, skilled, creating an empire, or the LeBron James. That's yes, some people will get there. The vast majority of American wealth is created through an income job, right? So like a higher income, and a home specifically. And I want to talk about a home because that's the place where race ends up making everything else sort of, it makes wealth creation difficult, right? Because wealth, your home also determines your income potential in many sort of intangible ways. So what kind of schools your kids go to, what kind of social capital there is, who is doing internships, right? That whole ladder up into those high income jobs are available to certain neighborhoods and they're not to other neighborhoods. And so really, when we're talking about middle class wealth, we're talking about an asset that is a home that builds in value. Okay, and so historically, and this is still the case, when neighborhoods become Black, or if they are Black, except for very few, high income Black neighborhoods that have been legacy sort of that way, Black home values don't retain their value. They certainly don't increase in value like in certain white neighborhoods do. And so that is how racism and white privilege is embedded in capital structures. And part of that, and a majority of that, is that history of segregation and explicit not providing credit into Black communities. So all of the white suburbs and the white communities were subsidized by government mortgage loans. And that was not available to Black communities, like specifically not available for many years. And then after like the civil rights law said, you can't actually specifically say that you can only sell to a Caucasian person, because that's how it was until 1968. Post that, then you have, zoning, you have using zip codes instead. So once you've created these patterns of segregation, you actually don't need race, right? Then you see the subprime mortgage market going and targeting those areas that were mortgage deprived and extracting wealth from those areas. So if you really scan out and look at the way the mortgage and credit structure works, you really do see that whiteness correlated with wealth creation and a good kind of credit, like a wealth enhancing credit. And then there's wealth depriving credit, right? So subprime loans, payday loans, and it's really two disparate credit systems. And I think that is the major underlying factor in the racial wealth gap that is still perpetuating it. It really is not, we have not disrupted that pattern.
So Black banks, what role can they play in wealth creation now?
The way I kind of end the book is I say that anything that looks like justice for the Black community and closing the racial wealth gap has to involve, the institutions that created it, right? Black banks didn't create the racial wealth gap. The Fed, the Treasury, the FHA, the federal government, the state governments, those institutions have to be involved in repairing the damage that they caused. I think Black banks and Black businesses should be at the head of the table directing the move, because they know a lot about sort of the community and the businesses and how and what are the needs. But I think as far as capital investments, it has to come from the same place that white people got it from, right? Which were those institutions that create wealth: the Fed, the Treasury, the FHA, the Ginnie Mae, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. All of those agencies have to be involved in repairing the racial wealth gap.
So basically, you're saying that the institutions that caused it should be responsible for fixing it.
Yeah.
right?
Yes, and that's what I mean when I talk about reparations. I mean repair damages. You know, you screwed something up. You did it based on race. It
Right.
was a broken social contract with American citizens that were promised over and over again that their rights would be protected equally under the law, and they were not, over and over and over again. So when you break a contract, you pay damages. You pay full compensation. Now, I believe that full compensation is impossible because the trauma that is caused, the injustices that, you know, have deprived lives and livelihoods. So I don't think we can get to full compensation. There's just not enough money that can compensate the Black community. But you can do things with money. And we're talking completely closing the racial wealth gap. And that has to be step one. And then talking about actually having like a truth and reconciliation and looking at how these myths of racism were created to justify power structures and how those myths continue to, you know, traumatize Black children, and how they continue to kill Black men at the hands of the police, and how they continue to deprive Black women of adequate health care, you know, and maternal deaths, right? I mean, all of these, the racism that embeds and gets into disparate health outcomes were all myths created to justify an exploitative economy. And a structure. And so we need to deal with those myths and really kind of call out those who continue to perpetuate it. And I don't think we have come close to anything that looks like truth and reconciliation.
Agreed. When you say like closing the wealth gap, right? So in my opinion, I'm looking at it as, okay, white people had a 400-year head start after the races. We're creating wealth, right? Now we're in 2020, and according to reports, there really isn't any wealth in the Black community, right? So 400-year head start versus kind of at A or B. How do you now close that if wealth is like, there's compound interest, and it's like they're not going to be like, okay, well, let's stop creating wealth so the Blacks can catch up, you know, like how do you even close that?
You can do it so easily. I mean, the way you close it, first of all, is it has to be race specific. It can't be some colorblind, everybody gets it, right? Because the way that it was created specifically for non-Black people, right? It's just like that is how the FHA worked, is, okay, Black people can't get these loans, okay? And so to repair that damage, it can't just be like, we can't use race, right? Which is the Supreme Court sort of like legal thing, which is a sham, but they're saying, oh, anything has to be colorblind. That has to go. And then I think the way you close it is you do have to direct it to those communities from which it's so it's not, it's bringing up the mean, and we're not saying like everyone's going to have the same income. Obviously, like, you know, the way the white wealth is, some people are going to be richer than other people. Some people are still going to be billionaires and some people are not, right? We're talking about a mean, okay? So we're talking about the way that the FHA created a white middle class, right? And so we're talking a middle class, like you have a job, you have a mortgage, you can pay your bills, your kids go to school in a safe place. We're not talking about like planes and stuff, right? That kind of wealth we know how to do. We created that wealth during the New Deal, and we just didn't do it for Black communities. And so how do you do that? You know, you assure, you know, a safe investment mortgage. Like we don't need, like it shouldn't require, you know, the Black community to be like especially financially savvy. That's never been a white community thing, right? This idea that like, oh, it's a financial education thing is total baloney, right? It's just about providing decent loans in homes that increase in value and providing ladders, the same ladders up for kids that are provided to white kids, right? So schools that are resourced, neighborhoods that are not over policed, that violence not hanging over your head, the toxins not in your neighborhood. So, you know, it looks like ending segregation patterns. It looks like providing middle-class jobs and homes in the same way that were provided for white folks. College education. So I would look at canceling student debt just across the board for Black students. I would look at grants like the way that we did the Homestead grant. So one of the things that I proposed is a Homestead 21st Century Homestead Act, which you would look at some of these formerly redlined areas that are still majority Black, and they haven't changed. If they have changed, they've been resegregated somewhere. So as gentrification patterns have worked in certain cities, there has been a push out into other cities, right? So those areas, and then taking those properties, whether they're abandoned or you do an eminent domain, like you actually take properties or you build properties, depending on where we're at. So like Detroit or Baltimore, there's just tons of abandoned properties, right? These are, the markets are broken. You've got private equity firms sweeping in, you know, paying the unpaid taxes and buying up properties for like $5,000. You could just land bank every property in Detroit, Baltimore, several other cities that are like this, redevelop using federal bonds, and then grant them, just give them to Black homeowners who, you know, are there anyway. That community, just, you kind of kickstart revitalization, and then they would pay whatever they were paying in rent lower and have a mortgage, right? So you're, you know, you have this property grant the way that the FHA did. So it's, and then that because you're doing it holistically, you're building wealth. This is something that has been done in America. It's been done abroad, like a Marshall Plan. You know, the trick is that you have to do it all at once. That's how communities revitalize. I mean, looking at Seattle in the 80s, 90s to now, look at how those property values just skyrocketed. San Francisco, New York, right? So there are these patterns, and you look at, like, you need certain things. You need, you know, broadband, you need clean water, you need homes, like a majority of homes to not be blighted. And so you manufacture those things like we did in the 1930s, and then you grant them over to the same folks that you left out the first time. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be like easy to figure out who gets it and who doesn't. And I don't want to get caught up in that. Like, I don't think we're going to use like a one drop rule or anything like that. I think, but people want to skip right to that point. Well, who gets it, right? And I am of the opinion that it's better to be over generous than be stingy about this, because, you know, as long as we're raising up the bottom, it's fine with me. I mean, what I don't want is like private equity firms to get it. I don't want, right, like banks to get this money, right? But if it's like, you know, low income folks who maybe aren't descendants of slaves, like I'm not going to worry about that. I know other people maybe want to have that debate. That's not, I'm just talking about the bringing up the sort of base here. And I don't want the debate to get too far ahead of itself. Right?
Yeah, I agree completely. So in the book, you are quoted as saying, and maybe this might be, I heard this in an interview. You said you segregate people, but you can't segregate money.
Right.
So what do you mean by that? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So that was the premise of Black banking, is that if you would keep the Black dollar in the community. And you can do that insofar as you have sovereignty, so you can shut off the borders, you know. But what happened is, when everyone starts out, if all the white people have the property and the Black people weren't able to, and then you say, okay, well, now we're gonna give loans only to Black people, and this is in the 30s, 40s, 50s, like in the era before, you can't actually. Banks can't keep that money in because it's going to leak out. As soon as you buy a property, it's going to go. And if those white banks aren't lending back, that money just escapes. So when you look at the balance sheets of these banks and the frustrations of these Black bankers, is that the money was always leaving and never coming back in through loans or through grants or through purchases, right? Black buyers were always paying a premium on a home, and then those properties dropped in value, and white banks were never investing in, right? So the way that banks create money and they create wealth, but they do it because they're part of the same system, and you keep lending and you can make more money as you lend. Black banks can't keep that money if they're just outside of that system, right? So the people can be segregated, but the money's going to leak out if you have this radical wealth differential. And the wealth differential is about capital. It's property. What do you own, right? That's the wealth building. Now, credit can lead to capital. Credit can lead to a home, but you need to keep the capital base within a community if you're going to maintain segregation, right? If you're not going to maintain segregation, so this is, you know, you look at the Italian model or the Asian or the Irish model, right? They were also poor and segregated, not as segregated, right? So there's never the amount of segregation that the Black community had. But then the FHA, they were cut in to that white American suburb and immediately sort of became white, and those gaps changed. But, you know, they did integrate, right? So that's one way to do it. One way to do it is just, we're not going to discriminate based on race. I think America is so built on anti-Black racism that insofar as we see race, it's going to be anti-Black. Right. So I do think we could not see race. I'm not holding my breath for that. Right.
The reason I actually bring up that quote, because obviously, you know, the company is called Shop Black, and we're about promoting Black-owned businesses and want to see them grow, scale, and get to the point where they're national and international conglomerates, right? So I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on the role of Black-owned businesses in creating wealth, or as wealth creation vehicles, and how can they get to that point? Is it only through becoming large-scale enterprises that then hire, or what is that route?
Yeah. So let me be clear about what I am saying and what I'm not saying. What I am saying is, in order to close the racial wealth gap, it has to be from the institutions that created it, the white structure. What Black banks and Black businesses can do and have always done is to not exploit the Black community, is to be a place where Black ideas and Black creativity and Black art and Black genius can be advanced without that racist sort of boot on the neck, right? So I think I'm all about supporting these institutions from the bottom up as a grassroots thing, which is exactly what you're doing. I am not about Richard Nixon or Donald Trump saying, you know what, just do Black capitalism, because that I think is a decoy, right? So I try to make this distinction clear in the book, but I want to be very clear to this group, because I think I always shop Black, I always bank Black, I always try to choose, any provider that I can, because I think part of racism is in the way that market demand is embedded in those racial, just racism straight, right? So where we buy stuff, we think of it as higher value if it's for a white institution or big institution, or we don't want to pay extra because and ignore the sweatshop labor of the and increasingly what we're going to have, and this is beyond the racial inequities, is we have like 4 monopolies that we're going to be beholden to in the next. I mean, like Amazon is a behemoth, right? So I actually just believe in spending money locally anyway and I don't think that's the answer. Like, I actually still think that we should break up those monopolies because they're squeezing out so many small businesses. So on a policy scale, but on an individual scale, you do what you can. I don't think there's enough individuals to beat Amazon's marketing behemoth, but I do think we can push politically on that as well.
So when you say monopolies, obviously you just mentioned Amazon. Are you talking about like different verticals like media monopolies and like telecom, or is that what you mean by that? Or Facebook is a monopoly, Google, Apple, so any app you have, it's got to be in the app store, right? And so are they crushing competitors? Amazon, they're operating a platform that many small businesses use to go to market. Facebook, the algorithms for the ads, Google, the way that they promote certain things and can crush other things. So if you're a small business, you're a Black business, and you want to advertise to your consumer, increasingly, you're going to hit one of these nodes of power. And hopefully it's fair. But there is evidence that they are pushing forward some of their own brands or their own kind of using their algorithm to bias against certain things that I would not want them to have that much power. And I think when you look at the small businesses that get crushed first, it's going to be the Black and brown businesses, because they have, less political power to push against, and so for me, it does always come back to political power, because the market will crush even successful Black businesses. And this is where I try to, I talk about the Tulsa riots. I talk about the domestic terrorism against successful Black businesses. And we're not talking about those things now, but there is another way in which violence is enacted
when, small businesses or Black businesses get too successful, there are other ways to crush them besides mobs and bombs and fire, right?
Sure. And that you kind of answered my next question I was going to ask. I was going to ask, what do you think comes first? Does political power lead to economic power,
Yeah.
or vice versa?
Political power leads to economic power, I think, because you can gain economic power and politics will, several things. One is a lot of middle-class wealth is created through political programs, through the New Deal and through other things like that. And, a lot of times the machinery of the state ends up creating markets, leaving people out of markets, boosting certain markets. And I think we talk about free markets and we talk about free market capitalism, but I don't think we have that in the economy. We've never really had that. I mean, you look at the Black experience and that puts the lie to the free market myth, right? Black businessmen, Black bankers, Black homeowners have never been able to take advantage of capitalism because their property wasn't protected by the law. There wasn't an equal playing field. And then at one point they were like, any repair of that old system, they were like, oh, that's anti-capitalist, right? It's used as a rhetorical weapon, and it's not. It's a myth. Even today, like the way that the Fed bolsters certain markets and not others, the way that you have the way the banks work is really underwritten by the federal government. They would not exist but for all sorts of these programs. So that's just important to note.
All right. So if you don't have, so political power leads to economic power, right? So what is the biggest way to influence these laws and legislature? And like, what are you seeing happening, I guess, recently that is addressing the wealth gap in terms of like people on the Hill and whatnot?
I think we are going to see some, I'm being hopeful here. We are going to see some changes. I think there is a demand now. I think we are at a pivot point. I would hope that it looks like reparations. I would hope that it looks like real wealth creating capital-based programs.
Right.
And I am hopeful. And that's what's necessary. And part of the reason I'm hopeful is because I think there's a growing sense, one, that this myth of color blindness was blown by Trump. So we have a racist country, always have. We also have a country that is not racist. Like there is a strand, obviously, of justice, but the racism has always been there. It's never left.
Right.
And so I think that pointing that out has been useful to wake some folks up. And I do think that the movement I'm seeing against sort of those myths of neoliberalism or capitalism, or that idea that like we actually don't have a capitalist economy. I think some people are now anti-capitalist. I always point out, like, I don't care. We just don't have capitalism. So be anti-capitalist, but it's a theory. You can propose or oppose, but this is not the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy is capitalism for some, and for others, a lot of state aid. Okay, so in that way, I am hopeful, but I'm also, like I said in the beginning, watching for how these things get twisted.
Okay, and in wrapping up, I was gonna ask, like, what are you working on next? What's next for Mrsa?
I am doing a book about the way that neoliberalism or these market rhetoric logic that we're stuck in has like basically ruined this country, I think, in inequality sense. Not ruined, because I think there's still hope, but basically was based on a civil rights backlash and an anti-Black racism. So taking chapter 6 of that book and really fleshing out exactly how that worked in policy. So how anti-Black racism, both in the US and abroad, I'm actually looking at an international lens too, in the South African apartheid movement, in the anti-colonialist movements across the world, how there was a real threat there to the US empire, and how that power was reinforced through ideologies and through trade agreements that were very one-sided. And so it's we'll see.
National
Yeah.
winner. I like that. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So, looking out for that. When can we expect that, or is that still?
Oh, not for a while. It's
Okay.
gonna be a while. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, it sounds exciting either way. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And
Okay.
we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay.